Welcome to the Coffee with Kareem podcast. I am your host, Karim Sirajuddin. Today's show is a recording of an interview I had with the Boys in the Cave podcast. Some really nice brothers out in Australia talk about the field of psychology, secular and sacred knowledge, comparing Islamic psychological concepts with Western psychology, as well as unpacking a bit more notions of depression and happiness and how to have well-being in your life. Don't forget to show the Boys in the Cave some love. Check out their show, leave them a review. And thank you for listening and subscribing to the Coffee with Kareem podcast. Special thanks and love to my patrons. Join our Patreon community today at patreon.com/coffeewithkareem and support this show. Please leave this podcast a review on iTunes to help us get more exposure. And if you're looking for personal or relationship counsel, please visit nurhumanconsulting.com to live happily with harmony using techniques from psychology and Islamic spiritual values. Thanks again for tuning in to the Coffee with Kareem podcast.
My name is Tanzim, and today we have a very special guest with us. His name is Karim Sirajuddin, founder of New Human Consulting. He has completed his BA in Psychology and Religion, followed by MA in East-West Psychology with a specialization in spiritual counseling. He is a certified life and relationship coach with years of teaching and community outreach experience. And also, on top of all of this, he has started his own podcast show called Coffee with Kareem, and he's also based out in California. So, Assalamu alaikum, Kareem, and welcome to Boys in the Cave.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. I like the furniture in this cave. It's nice.
Great to hear. We know that you've been, in the field of psychology. This particular field is a growing field, even amongst the Muslim community. So I just wanted to kind of insights into what made you want to undertake psychology in undergrad and to continue it as a profession.
Sure. Well, I've always enjoyed people. And I'm a people's person and learning about different people and cultures. And I had a pretty, mashallah, diverse upbringing. So my parents were immigrants and we moved they came to Massachusetts and I was born there. I went to Roman Catholic school when I was young. The first time I made official dawah was when I was 7 years old. In a classroom with a nun, my nun was a teacher, Sister Mary Julia, God rest her soul. And then later I moved to a predominantly Jewish town where I also, interacted with all kinds of people there. So at age 16, when I took psychology as an elective in high school, I knew that's what I wanted to study. And alhamdulillah, as soon as I began university, I already knew what I wanted to do. Sometimes we're undeclared for the first 3 years, but that wasn't my situation. And then I double majored and also did comparative religion. And also, alhamdulillah, had the opportunity, even as an undergraduate, to do teaching assistantships for professors, especially when it came to Islam and the human and social sciences of the Middle East and understanding the culture that was happening there. And 9/11 actually happened when I was an undergraduate, and that was in Boston. So it was actually right near where these planes went out. It was next to the airport. So there's just been a lot of themes in my life that I feel there's been a calling for understanding people, bridging communities, and multicultural sensitivity, so to speak.
Yeah, subhanAllah. I guess you mentioned the starting point of giving dawah and, when you were young. And actually, subhanAllah, I was listening to podcasts by the Mad Mamluks, and people can check that out, inshallah. And they talked about some people, they also they get flustered by the encounter of maybe a non-Muslim, and if they have like a religious dialogue, it kind of puts them away because they don't know enough. So what happens, that becomes a trigger to know more about the deen, even though they're not practicing Muslims as such. And alhamdulillah, that becomes the starting journey of actually learning the deen and then, having that certainty later on in their life. So I guess, would you say that was a starting or a trigger point for you?
I could definitely relate to that, for sure.
And also, in regards to, your journey through psychology, suddenly now you're kind of doing your own podcast as well. And subhanallah, even I'm listening to on a regular basis, alhamdulillah, and I'm based out in Sydney, Australia. And what I want to know is what made you want to start a podcast after you're, doing all this stuff, through psychology and doing stuff in the community.
Well, first of all, thank you for listening to the Coffee with Kareem podcast. I think you could be doing better things with your time. But the intention for that show was, I've, alhamdulillah, given the opportunity and the blessing to work exclusively with Muslims. That was my intention, because I knew that, when it comes to our other brothers and sisters in humanity, they have, mashallah, many clinicians and therapists and counselors and coaches serving them, and we didn't. So my focus was about serving the Muslims, and that, of course, took a long time to get to where I am today. Because there is that stigma around mental health or psychology. Everyone just thinks about Freud. So after accumulating many years of educational, coursework that I developed and taught on the ground, and alhamdulillah, have had the opportunity to work with over 1,000 Muslim clients in the last 7 years, I decided, I find that obviously I have a lot of frameworks and concepts that have been systematized in the work that I do with people, with couples, with families. And I thought the podcast would be a great way to share some of those insights with everybody, as well as, bring awareness to the Muslim and American society of all the wonderful things and gifts that Muslims are doing out there. So it's also a great way for me to just harness the network I've built over the years and get those people on to talk about what they're doing to make America better and to improve the Muslim community wherever they are.
Yeah, I can relate to that a lot, in the sense that, me and my, the other boys in the cave members, when we wanted to start this podcast, we realized that, for the age we're at, because I'm 20, and we're having these kind of deep questions, deep discussions, and it wasn't we felt like it was going to waste, or just having that conversation, that's it. We feel like more people should benefit from it. So we felt like even a podcast would get that kind of idea across, and once you kind of promote it on your personal social media, for example, people might tune in and actually, inshallah, benefit from it. And even me talking to you right now, it makes the boys in the cave, we learn more from getting all these guests from different fields and areas of study to talk about their experiences as well, and that kind of opens up a new kind of dimension and world for us, that inshallah, like, we can benefit from it, and my people that I know can benefit, and even the audience that listens to our podcasts can benefit from it, inshallah. So I hope you're getting that kind of response from your own audience and who's tuning into your podcast as well.
Alhamdulillah. And I'm a subscriber of Boys in the Cave as well. So
Alhamdulillah.
Yeah. Last show I heard, I think, was a couple of weeks ago I think you had a sister on, you guys were discussing Orientalism and Occidentalism.
Yeah. Abida Ora, great guest. Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, mashallah. So keep up the good work.
Thank you so much. Yeah, like, that's the other thing where we feel like, since we're in Australia, it's all the kind of big podcasts, or even the Muslim podcasts, they're out in America and Canada and out that way, and it's really filtered. Like, I grew up listening to all the kind of dawah material that's in America, right? And there's nothing really here in Australia, even though the shuyukh and there's scholars around. Like, I'm in contact with them, but there's no kind of platform to get their ideas across, and their names to be heard by people overseas. So I feel like, inshallah, like, I guess the goals that we've set for each other, for our own kind of podcast, and we reach it in one day, alhamdulillah. But
mashallah,
in regards to what I do want to delve into is the whole kind of secular field of psychology, and also Islamic psychology, because we know we have that spirituality, practicing Islam. But in regards to the field of psychology, I feel like it kind of connects with the Islamic tradition, and because the field of psychology, kind of from my limited knowledge of it, it kind of deals with the observable. For example, studying the brain or our actions, for example. But, comparing it to, Islam, we know there's things that we can't see, and things like the consciousness, for example, like the fitra and the nafs, for example, we have to deal with. concepts that are obviously not dealt with in secular psychology. And do you feel like from your side there's big overlaps between the Islamic spirituality side of things and secular psychology, or do you think there's more differences than there are commonalities?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, let me just define psychology, simply. It's the study of the self, and that includes mental processes, emotional responses, and behavioral patterns. And certainly when you think about Islam as a tradition, Islam is meant to be a guidance for whom? For humankind. Right, and so if something is supposed to guide humanity, it has to also understand the way the self works. So I feel like religion, in a way, it's about psychology, sociology, and anthropology. Because it includes all these things. It includes how to help and improve the collective as well as the individual. So from that aspect, sure, they have commonalities in that they're trying to understand the human being and how to improve in well-being. Now, where it does get tricky or different, and I think it's becoming more so in the last 10 years, but I certainly saw it as an undergraduate as well, where the constructs of what it means to be human is being structured by individuals or thinkers that don't necessarily consider what we may call spirituality or the soul or revealed revelation and religion, right? So already that's going to be a major difference, because if we have a science of psychology that tells us this is healthy, this is unhealthy, this is pathology, this isn't, but who's actually coming up with those definitions and that meaning? It's somebody else, right? And if it's not being inspired or guided or checked by what we consider to be true, i.e. Islam and what the Quran and Sunnah, have demonstrated, then you're gonna face a lot of difficulties. And this is something I find with, let's say, Muslim clients I've worked with. Like, a Muslim has a pornography addiction. When they go see a therapist that's covered by their health insurance, 90% of the time, the therapist tells them this is healthy, this is fine, as long as you're not spending money, as long as it's not sabotaging your job, you're still going home for dinner. Then what's the big deal with watching pornography? It's a natural part of being human, right? We have desires, you want to fulfill them. What's the problem? And obviously for a lot of Muslims, that's not going to fly. So even though both Islamic psychology and psychology are about understanding the human being, the self, and improving the self, the standards of that definitely there are some major differences, but that doesn't mean that there isn't overlapping concepts or techniques as well.
That's actually something I do want to delve deep into, but the whole essence of, you just mentioned the idea of the soul and stuff. Do you feel like from the kind of secular psychology angle that they only portray the human being as just, purely a material working machine? Like, they just look at it just a physical structure and we just need to fix you up. And, and the brain's just, neurons moving around. And because we know through the Islamic conception there's the fitra, the nafs, desires that we have to fight with and whatnot. So do you feel like from the secular side it's just purely, we're just like a physical being?
Well, that is more so the direction it's going, but you do have, of course, schools of thought in Western psychology, such as Jungian psychology or transpersonal psychology, which is more of what I specialize in, transpersonal or humanistic or existential, where it does consider other aspects of the human condition, like the spirit or archetypes or these types of things that you find in religion and these types of expressions, if you will, of consciousness that humans have demonstrated throughout the centuries. But now, of course, there is a greater academic and even political agenda to make psychology more of a quote-unquote hard science or a medical science. And so we're seeing a lot more advancement in neurology, which is great. But you also have of course, your worldview is going to influence your instrumentation and conceptualization of science and of psychology. So, for instance, if we don't believe that there is a soul anymore, which is pretty common in the Western academia, we're going to start to now assume that consciousness is rooted in neurology. But this is one of the hard problems of science today, is the problem of consciousness. We can't justify or fully explain what consciousness is yet, and we certainly don't have enough causal data from neural processes to validate any of those claims that consciousness is rooted in the brain. That's one of the problems, is there's no part in the brain that we know of yet that is actually responsible for the brain to execute and do everything that it does. It just does what it does, right? So for example, if I move my hand up and down, there's a signal from my brain going through my nervous system that is telling my hand to go up and down. It's happening extremely fast. But what's making my brain send the signal? There's nothing in the brain that makes it do what it does. And so that's one of the mysteries of consciousness, for example. And from an Islamic perspective, we hold that, yes, there is as Aristotle put it, a ghost in the machine. We're not just this complex package of neurons and biochemical processes, and that's it. There's certainly more to us than that. And this aspect of ourselves has to also be nourished and fed, just like your physical body. And if it's not, it will impact the physical body. So I don't know if I answered your question or I veered off too far, but I'll stop there.
No, like it's basically how you mentioned the whole idea of consciousness, and science is yet to kind of prove it. But you brought up the idea of in psychology, there's different schools of thought. It reminds me, is there like a Hanafi psychology, Maliki psychology? Is that how it is in that whole school field of psychology?
Yeah, but this is what you find in many sciences, right? You have, for example, different theories or approaches of physics. In psychology, certainly you have that as well. So you have what's called behaviorist psychology, which focuses more on stimuli and conditioning and behavioral responses. You have psychoanalytical, which is known to be attributed to Freud, which is about analyzing the past in order to understand the present. You have cognitive, which focuses more so on the mental processes. So you do have different schools of thought. Some of them build off of each other. Some of them are extensions of others. Some of them kind of rebuilt a new architecture from the beginning. Carl Jung, for example, who's famous for Jungian psychology and archetypal psychology, he was actually a student of Freud, and then he broke away from the school of thought that Freud had established and started his own school of psychology, which is interesting. But more importantly, what we have to, I think, what I want to bring up here is that what we call the mind today is actually a modern construct. And there's a very dense book called God Machine, which actually talks about the Western historical evolution of how the soul in their worldview became the mind. It was a modern construct to replace the idea of losing the soul, so to speak, because as we know in Western history, you had the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and different evolution, if you will, of thought. And that included breaking away from many religious constructs and developing a more positivist or empirical outlook of the world. And so as a result of that, they dismissed the soul and replaced it with this idea of the mind. So oftentimes when Westerners talk about the mind, it's very similar to what, people in the East perhaps would still maintain as the soul, because that's exactly what it is. It's that part of us that you can't quite narrow down in physical, or you can't peg it in only physical processes, yet there is this transcendent aspect to it. Like, where is the mind? It's not in the brain. And even in Western psychology, they believe in ghaibi things, unseen things. For example, the unconscious. The unconscious, by definition, is something you don't have direct access to, yet it influences your awareness. Just like the unseen realm that Allah created, you don't have direct access to it, but it actually influences the seen world, you see. So there are a lot of concepts there that aren't even quote unquote empirically validated. It's just interesting how, some Western psychology has seen itself as really breaking away from all this stuff when some of the central concepts that are carried, like psychoanalysis and this idea of an ego or a superego or your instincts, many of these things you could trace back how it evolved in the first place.
Yeah, that reminds me how you're saying through the different schools, they're trying to explain things like through the mind and kind of getting rid of the idea of the soul. And how it reminds me of, I don't know if you've heard about Sam Harris. And also Russell Brand, they had a dialogue. And because, he's a more atheist line of thinking, so he kind of explained away the idea of consciousness through just physical processes, or that's what I kind of took away from it. So I feel like there's that kind of distinction that since you can't see, as you just explained, the unseen, you just have to you're left to kind of explain it away on a physical kind of level. And I guess that's where people like in secular society and even through atheistic frame of mind tend to go down that route. Whereas us Muslims, that's why you're in the psychology field, because, we know Islamically it's not the case. And it's about connecting the dots through the Islamic tradition with the kind of current psychology through the secular lens.
Correct. Yep. Absolutely. That's a good example. I'm a subscriber to Sam Harris as well on his podcast. And they just have some very fascinating discussions. And like, he's a perfect example of, when you have a particular worldview, it's going to influence the possibilities and outcomes and instrumentation of that science. So for Sam Harris, consciousness can be explained through neuroscience. It just hasn't been yet, but that's his motive. And he's also gone to such an extent where he's one of the, he's one of the individuals who really pushes this idea of there is no such thing as free will. Because again, if you reduce all intentionality to neural circuitry, which you don't even have control over, then is there actually free will? And that's another big debate that has been forged in the human and philosophical sciences today.
SubhanAllah, I guess that's where the direction is going with that kind of a foundation, alhamdulillah, I guess, because we have, Islam, so we have that moral, we have that kind of objective morality, or that sense of who we are as a human being, whereas these guys are just discovering and they don't know. And that's why there's so much dialogue and debate about all of these things, because we're going through that mindset of looking through things through only a purely materialistic lens. And there has to be a sense of element of rationality that needs to be applied, because as you just said, it's scary to think that there's no free will, right? There has to be something in the unseen to at least give us a sense of control over our physical processes at this moment. Like, for example, I wrote this in my Twitter account a while back, but the atheists in this, probably the wrong direction is going towards a podcast, but I'll just give this quick example where, in studies, like for example, engineering, they only study, how motors work and all that, but you don't, because you're studying physical processes, it doesn't mean there's someone who created the motor in the first place, right? So I feel like these kind of studies are leaning towards that. Because you only see the physical processes, you neglect the whole idea of what created in the first place, like a motor. Because once you study a motor, you're not in the mindset of thinking, oh, how did that person create that motor in the first place? You're only studying what it does. So I think that's the same thing can be kind of line of thinking can be applied to modern psychology, for example, and even how we view the world, and that's why people lean towards saying that there's no God, subhanAllah. So I guess what I do want to touch on is the idea of spirituality that is utilized in modern psychology, because you said there are kind of different schools of thought in that regard. And do you feel like something for meditation, it may assist, or that's a way of making someone go towards, I guess, being happy? Because from I actually watched an interview of some psychologist, and she's a Muslim, and she mentioned that when she, finished her degree and started working in a hospital as a psychologist, what happened was there was a strict rule in place in that hospital there that you can't really discuss the ideas of spirituality or even religion with your patients. You just have to go purely on the kind of methodological sense of the current, secular psychology and how they go about things. So do you feel like that's what you've encountered possibly, or is it just a product of the different kind of schools of psychology?
Yes and no. That definitely does exist, and there are people who, when they study psychology or work in a clinic, for instance, they are told exactly the same thing, because there are these legal protocols now and political agendas which influence how we help people in the field of psychology and human science, right? So it's not uncommon to hear that. There are many situations like that where people were told, like, don't talk about the soul, don't talk about this, don't use that. So that is certainly a barrier that some people have encountered. And what's interesting is you'll meet psychologists that have faith and psychologists that don't, like anything. Even people that don't believe in God, like Sam Harris, I would say he would describe himself as a spiritual person. I mean, he wrote books on this and talks about meditation extensively. So it's interesting because even though we don't want to accept this idea of a creator, and again, it also depends on what kind of God you're talking about, because I'm definitely an atheist when it comes to certain gods or conceptions of God, right? Obviously, we don't believe in some bearded man in the sky or some spaghetti monster, but that's not, I don't think that has anything to do with what Islam talks about theologically, as far as the uncaused cause of everything. It's a very different idea than some anthropomorphic figure in the clouds. But even people who are atheists can still consider themselves, of course, moral or spiritual. It's just going to have a different flavor or a different procedure, if you will, like meditation. And what's that really about? It's about clearing your mind from all the chatter and becoming a lot more aware of the essence of yourself and this part of you that is what they call the self of no self. In other words, the essential life force that is generating your consciousness and isn't cluttered with all the egoic identity and attachments. So that's, for example, one example of how a person who doesn't believe in God or religion still finds spirituality through a practice like meditation, for instance.
Okay, so you would say that it basically varies from person to person who you talk to in the psychology field, where they may implement something like meditation as a way of, gaining that inner peace that they seek. Because I guess from my kind of what I'm seeing or observing in the field of psychology is that we're leaning more towards, if someone goes and visits the psychologist, for example, they either take medication or just do treatment. So it's more like a physical kind of thing they have to undergo, whereas the kind of, the idea of seeking spirituality through, meditating or praying, for example, is kind of neglected. Do you think the field of psychology is leaning more towards it, or as you explained, because of the different kind of schools of thought and kind of different faith groups that are involved in the field of psychology, that you get kind of a different approach from person to person?
Yeah, you definitely get different approaches from person to person, but I would say that the dominant ideology in academia and these major psychological associations like the APA, the American Psychological and Psychiatric Associations, they are influenced by this dominant ideology, which is not very interested or compelled by religion and spirituality. Now, of course, you do have aspects, departments. Like I know that the APA, I saw an article in this last year, which was talking about how they want to increase in their multicultural psychology sensitivity and, learning about how psychology is practiced in India or in Egypt and these types of things, and seeing how there could be a benefit to that, right? So you do have, of course, people that are trying to be more open and understanding different alternatives. But there's, of course, the dominant ideology, which is, I think, what really matters, because when you go study any field, you're going to come out with the ideas of the dominant ideology and agenda. So that is unfortunately the case when it comes to the field of psychology. And some Muslims that I've met who have their degrees in psychology and are clinicians, they think like a non-Muslim when it comes to understanding the human being, and because that's what they were taught. So if they're not grounded in Islamic precepts and ilm an-nafs, for example, the science of the self in Islamic tradition, there's going to be a lot of things they're going to accept as valid or true, even though it may not be. Right?
SubhanAllah, I guess, yeah, that's the kind of danger of not having those kind of basic elements of Islam. You know, if you haven't learned it, then you delve into these kind of fields of study and you don't know where you're going because you're just kind of following the herd, I guess. Because even from, you know, studying a degree, it could be any degree, what you're doing, you're just force-fed a field of study where you don't actually learn unless you do like a proper, you know, PhD in it, for example, but you just take in what you're taught and you don't get to question it too much. And that's the scary thing, where you don't have that Islamic kind of foundations. You might go to places like, you know, might reject Allah, you know, subhanAllah. So I guess it's really important to have that kind of foundation of Islam when you delve into these sciences. Like, do you feel that's the case?
Yes, and I would say more so for liberal arts. You know, if you study philosophy or psychology, these types of things, not to say that you're not going to benefit from those degrees, but if you don't have a grounding in the Islamic worldview, you can be influenced or conditioned in very intellectually and spiritually harmful ways.
Okay, yep. In regards to, you just mentioned about different fields of studies, and I wanted to delve into the idea of depression because it is, you know, such a prevalent thing in today's society. What is depression from a secular perspective and the Islamic perspective? And also, like, is there some special Islamic remedy to cure this, or is it a mixture of utilizing the secular psychology and mixing it in with, you know, the Islamic side of things?
That's a good question. So, I mean, I think the first thing I want to clarify is, you know, when we say what's the secular perspective, what's the Islamic perspective, let's back up a second and just say, look, there's knowledge and science. And in my opinion, knowledge and science are both obviously tools and indications of the great architect of the universe, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so when you study anything, you're actually learning about the nature of the world, especially when you study things like science or physics, hard sciences, for example. Now, how much of that is Islamic or not Islamic has to do with what is it that you're studying, or what idea, or what outcome, or what evidence. So to say like, oh, there's an Islamic perspective on depression versus a secular perspective, I don't think that distinction is the right way to frame the question. Whatever is Islamic is always going to be whatever has been established, you know, to the best of our knowledge through science as well, right? Because that is exactly what everybody uses to understand the nature of things. But yes, things can be influenced based on your worldview. I don't deny that. So those of us who don't know, depression is when you have a perpetual state of sadness, amongst other symptoms like lethargy or lack of motivation and other things. But it's basically when you're in a very low mood a lot, and it's to such an extent that it causes dysfunction. Like you don't go to your job for 2 months, or you know, you don't talk or eat or sleep, etc. So depression can be caused by an internal reality, i.e. negative thinking. Depression can also be caused by an external factor, like some kind of major event happened, like a trauma or the loss of a loved one. And it can be caused by what you may say is physiological or biochemical. In other words, let's say an individual has a lack of producing dopamines and serotonin, which are responsible for, you know, positive moods. It's naturally produced in the body. So depression generally falls under these three categories, at least according to my understanding. And the first two are things that you can work through. I think anybody can work through, right? Feeling depressed because you lost somebody you loved is a natural thing, and you're supposed to go through that. It's also called grief, but you're going to recalibrate and find that homeostasis again. If you feel depressed all the time because you have a depressive or negative way of thinking constantly, then the way to heal that would be through cognitive behavioral therapy, of course, spiritual psychology and clarity, things like dhikra and recalibrating the concepts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your life and what the Quran teaches us about the human experience. These are all things that can help alleviate somebody from depression. But when you have something that's biochemical, for example, that requires now more hands-on medical treatment. Sometimes depression is caused also by a really bad diet. If you eat McDonald's every day for 30 years straight, of course you're not going to feel good or have energy or positive moods because you're not giving your body any live food, for instance, right? So those are, I think, the three basic ways you can understand what is depression. On this idea of happiness, living happily, I personally don't believe that we're supposed to be happy all the time. I think it's actually ridiculous to try to be happy all the time. And by happiness, we're talking about a high aroused state of joy and positivity. And some people are like that, mashallah, and good for them. That's great. But I think we have to step back and ask ourselves, why do we all want to be happy all the time? Because that's not full living. Life is never going to be this perfect stream of bliss and predictability. You're going to get curveballs. You're going to have tests and tribulations. You're going to have hardships. Things don't always go according to plan. People let you down. We all know this. And so life is going to have a spectrum of emotions, like sadness, like anxiety, like stress, like joy, like happiness, like hope, etc. And I think that the true question is, how do I find greater tranquility and contentment through the ups and downs of life? Because that's the case for everybody. You're gonna have ups and downs.
Yeah, like in regards to touching the idea of, being depressed or sad, for example, and you can take it like in both ways, where there's a non-Muslim, there's a Muslim. And I guess if the Muslim is kind of practicing and whatnot, he understands the whole idea of possibly being sad, and even looking through the stories in the Quran and the prophets going through certain hardships, and can understand that, okay, this is from possibly a test from Allah. Whereas from a kind of non-Muslim perspective, it's like their premise is the whole idea of I need things right here, right now. And then I guess when they set that benchmark, if they fall short, they get depressed. I guess it's like a kind of thing, the benchmark because they set that benchmark and they fall short, it causes problems, and it's kind of like a self-induced kind of sadness. And then do you feel like those kind of people, that are sad in that through that specific kind of instance, they visit the psychologist and they expect that, okay, there's some remedy or some treatment or some pills, it may kind of aid them? Or is it because you have to, as a psychologist, kind of delve into their kind of, family or life or their past history, for example, or how they think as a human being? Do you feel like these are the kind of the approaches that are taken by modern psychologists? Because even yourself being a Muslim, this kind of approach would be very resonate with the Islamic tradition. Whereas do you feel like even a non-Muslim, like even for example maybe Sam Harris was a psychologist, and would he take the same approach that kind of you would? Or is it kind of it might boil down to depends on the person itself?
It definitely depends on the person. Going back to the three categories of what can cause depression. Now, how Islamic psychology would add an extra layer to that is, okay, let's say I find out you're depressed because you have a lot of negative thinking patterns. For instance, you have what they call all or nothing thinking. It either has to be everything has to be perfect, or else it's you're not going to do it. Or I have to be a perfect Muslim, or I'm not going to be a Muslim at all. I have to do this perfectly, or I'm not going to do it at all. So that can cause a lot of setbacks in your life. Another way of negative thinking is everything is a catastrophic thinking. You're always assuming the worst case scenario, right? Or negative self-labeling, having this inner critic where you always put yourself down, or you take on the labels and criticisms of people as, absolutely true. So when you approach, let's say, a person who's not using faith or Iman as part of their treatment, they're of course going to work with the negative thinking and help you, journal that and replace it with positive and balanced thinking and use evidence and understand the situation and all these types of things. And that's what any Muslim psychologist should do as well. But the supplemental dimension, which I think can enhance in the progress and healing more deeply, in my opinion, is part of your, thinking and improvement of your negative thinking will include, of course, the constructs of the Quran and the Sunnah. So, for instance, if I'm so, down because I didn't get the job that I wanted, well, not only, do I have to be more positive and think about how I got to keep applying and networking and all these great tools, but for example, as a Muslim, I also have to remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the provider, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will open doors from places you never expected if you maintain that consciousness and you keep taking the means. This is a supplemental value or cushion, if you will, for your consciousness that's going to, I think, offer more to get over, let's say, negative thinking. And this, of course, includes purification of the heart and the practices and tools that Islam offers around nourishing the heart, because as you know, the heart influences the way we think as well. Right. So I think that Islamic approach to something like this would include all this other supplemental knowledge and tools that you're not necessarily going to find in the same way if you go get treated for negative thinking with a CBT therapist. They're not going to have that extra layer, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Like this reminds me of, I think I read about this. It's called, I think it's in psychology. It's like Beck's cognitive model of depression, where it's like you constantly, if your mindset is about negative thinking, you'll fall into further depression because of that trigger of the initial kind of instance or situation that caused you to have that initial period of depression, where if you can't have more of a negative thinking to go along with it and you live your life kind of towards that line of thinking, you'll fall into more kind of depression. It's like a cyclical kind of nature. So I guess through the Quran and Sunnah, we are taught these ideas of hope and being, grateful, for the blessings that we have, and all these things that kind of influences and shapes how we should kind of approach life. And I feel like that's the most powerful thing about Islam, that, for certain people, they may experience, not severe kind of depression, but even mild kind of depression where things don't go their way. And, Rasul Sallallahu went through probably the most hardships out of anyone in the face of the earth, right? And we have that example, and I guess sometimes we forget that, because we have the deen, but we forget that our prophet basically went through all this hardship to be where we are, as human beings today. So we can seek this kind of seek knowledge. It pushes us to have this thing, because as you said earlier, like, because we have Islam that kind of made you want to go towards the psychology line of thinking, because as you said, like, people like Sam Harris, they have this kind of ideology of, no free will. And we know that Islam being the truth, that's like, no, like, this is how we should approach psychology, including also obviously all the studies that we do. Like, for example, you just mentioned, eating McDonald's all the time, that will cause some sort of depression possibly. So it's about combining the knowledge. And I feel like that was a very important point that you made earlier, that it's not, because even I admit, like, I tend to kind of fall into that line of thinking that you said, if you're really into the deen, you're just like, whatever is from the secular,
you're going to be
if you're
fine.
like, you have the Islam versus secular West kind of thing, line of thinking. But it's about reading into the literature and reading into that and taking out the benefits and the actual proper, studies, and combining it with what we have, and it's about just gaining knowledge. And I think that's a really important point that you brought up earlier. And what I also want to kind of delve into is the idea of how much of a sense of taking care of yourself in terms of physical self and well-being, how much of an importance does that play in the role of avoiding depression and I guess being happy? Like, how much should we prioritize kind of a balanced diet or a healthy lifestyle? Is it as important as we think it is, or is it like we are not up to the mark? For example, even as most Muslims, like I guess most Muslims tend to be a bit more lazy, as probably the previous kind of generations that came before us. Do you feel like these kind of contribute to the idea of depression rising even in Muslim countries, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. But I want to come back to that because there was another point I wanted to make on the previous topic, which is that, yes, I think as Muslims, we should not have this disdain towards quote unquote secular knowledge or science, right? And that, it has to be cloaked in Islamic terminology for it to mean anything. I think that's absurd. And that's part of the reason why many of our countries look the way they do, to be honest, because we don't see it like that, that it's all beneficial knowledge. And on the other hand, we Muslims also can't just think that, as long as I'm practicing Islam, that's it. I don't need anything else. And I've had people say this to me, like, "Oh, brother, you don't need psychology. You just need the Quran and Sunnah." I'm like, well, the Quran and Sunnah is what taught me that we need psychology. And in fact, the Quran has a lot of psychology in it because it's about this human being, right? The human being's well-being. So, this idea of Islam as a way of life, I think that has to be further qualified in that Islam offers us a toolkit for how to be most successful in this life and the next life. But that doesn't mean that Islam, quote unquote, has all the answers, right? There's nothing in the Quran and Sunnah that tells you how to do heart transplant surgery or how to build a bridge, right? Or how to purify water or these types of things, right? So, but if you're a really good Muslim, in my opinion, you're going to be ignited to seek the knowledge and the procedures to solve these problems in your society and in your area, right? And that's what made the Islamic civilizations prosper and be that beacon of knowledge and light for centuries, right? As you well know. How did they do that? They didn't do that by saying, "Hey, we don't care about what the Chinese, the Indians, the Greeks, the Persians, the Egyptians, everyone before us had said. We're just going to do our own thing." No, that's not what they did. So I think we have to recognize that Islam, in my opinion, actually tells you to go seek knowledge, and not just religious knowledge, so to speak, right? But all knowledge that will benefit. Because the greatest scholars of Islam that I'm sure you admire are not ones that only knew one subject. They're the ones they were the polymaths. They were the Renaissance men and women that understood medicine, astronomy, physics, Islamic spirituality, fiqh, all these things. And that's what made their insights about the religion that much more profound and insightful, because it wasn't one-dimensional. So if we believe in Tawheed, we recognize that everything is interconnected and interdependent on each other. And the source of all of that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, everything that's going on around us is an ayah from Allah. And it can be for us or against us. Now, coming to your question of self-care, absolutely, self-care is extremely important. And you're right. I have observed this as well, that many Muslims do tend to neglect the nutrition, exercise, healthy lifestyle aspects of their existence. And we know that the body has rights upon us, right, according to Islam. And we find this already in the Sunnah. I saw Jean-Claude Van Damme, this famous martial artist who did a bunch of movies in the 90s. You're probably too young, but he basically talked about this, the Prophet ﷺ's advice about, eating 1/3, drinking 1/3, leaving 1/3. And he's a person who's obviously into fitness and martial arts. And there are many other examples like this, right? So we know that it's not sunnah to have a huge belly, right? One of the Sahaba, the Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, he saw a man with a huge belly. He said, "What is this?" And the man said, "Hada baraka minillah." This is blessing from Allah, that I got to eat so much all these years. And the Umar radiallahu anhu said, this isn't healthy. This isn't good. It makes you lazy. It makes you weak in energy and mind. You should not overeat and make your body carry around all this extra weight, because your body has a frame. It has a skeleton, it has muscles, it has organs, that if you're not nourishing it and giving it its rights, how will it continue to do everything that it does for you, right? And we are totally dependent on our bodies and our physiology, how our organs work. So this is a very important reminder that you're bringing up, that we as Muslims have to make sure that we do take up health and nutrition and exercise. And I think this is more common perhaps in Muslims in Australia and Canada and the US, but certainly in some of our other countries, vast majority are Muslims. This isn't a very common aspect of the culture, right? To take care of yourself and exercise. And self-care isn't just physical, it's also emotional self-care, right? Like learning how to relax, learning how to do things that are, recharging for you. And I get that not everybody is in a situation where they have the luxury to go get a massage, right? Or go to the steam room, because they may be living in poverty and they're just trying to survive. So, may Allah make it easy on all of us. But certainly, if we do have opportunities to take care of our health, and it doesn't mean you have to have a fancy gym membership. It could just be a 15-minute walk every day and not overeating. And that's, going to be a good thing.
So you, Kareem, you mentioned about the whole idea of happiness and the idea of, food providing the means of a healthy body, and that translates into being happy and how important it is. And so that reminds me of basically, I think someone like Hamza Yusuf delved into the whole idea of, baraka and food and gaining that kind of baraka, because it is important. Like, for example, a married couple, I guess in this kind of day and age where you can go out and grab quick Subway, $5-10, go home, and that's like your dinner. And I think, even as Muslims, we kind of take for granted the idea of cooking a good wholesome meal and getting, the baraka from that, because we had to kind of go out of our own way and cook very kind of healthy meal. Whereas, when you go out, you don't know what's being served, and the kind of blessings that might be in it, because it's all just processed food, right? And on top of that, it's just empty kilojoules. It's not really like, unless I know those healthy eaters that go to McDonald's and get the salads, but for the most part, I don't think people do that, because I guess salads would have been like the top meal to buy from McDonald's. But it's the whole idea of basically boiling down to eating good, wholesome food, and we shouldn't take that for granted. Because I think even during the times of Rasulullah, I don't think that there would have been, eat outs and eateries or restaurants, right? So everyone's just like kind of cooking their own meal, and even like the small amount of food they'll be eating, they'll be getting a lot of barakah from that, because we saw how Islam spread. I think that kind of, Allah blesses in different ways like that. And so I guess it's important to kind of realize the importance of food and eating a good wholesome meal, and making sure you don't rely on 2-minute noodles to kind of fill you up, and that could contribute to even something like happiness and depression, right? So do you think that kind of line of thinking is correct in the psychology sense?
Yeah, I mean, again, psychology is the study of the human being and optimal health and happiness. And of course, two things I'd like to say about food. The verses in the Quran, for example, chapter 2, verse 168, it talks about, I'll read the translation. "O humanity, eat of this earth what is halal and tayyib," halal and pure. So what is permissible for you according to Islamic law, and what is tayyib, what is good and pure. "And do not follow the footsteps of shaitan, indeed, for he is to you an open enemy." I find that really interesting that God commands us what to eat, and then he says, don't follow the footsteps of shaitan, right? So a couple of insights there to consider. Number one, it's not enough for food to just be permissible. In other words, we can't eat pigs, we can't eat carnivorous animals, we can't eat an animal that was already dead. But also Allah qualifies it and says it has to be tayyib, which means something that is pure and good. You can perhaps call that organic food, right? Or wholesome food, if you will. and then don't follow the footsteps of shaitan. So Allah knows best, but perhaps even in what we eat and consume could be a means of either worshiping Allah or disconnecting from Allah, because we know through a lot of research today that what you put in your body has a huge impact in how you feel, how you think, what kind of energy you have. And if obviously you're putting a lot of dead, processed, artificial food in a living organism, there's only so much potential and well-being one would experience. Food is also a type of worship. When you start to eat, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah, Alladhi at'amna wa ja'alna muslimin. Alhamdulillah, praise be to God who fed us and made us from the Muslims. Cooking for your family can be a worship with the right intention, because you're providing nourishment and love to your family. And so when you think about it, just preparing a meal doesn't have to be a chore or a task, but can also be a form of worship, because it's a type of giving that is a necessity. And the Prophet ﷺ told us, feed your neighbors and spread peace. One of the best ways to connect with humanity and to help your fellow human is by feeding them, because everyone needs to eat, regardless of their race, religion, or socioeconomic background.
SubhanAllah, and you mentioned the whole idea of, organic food and consuming it. And I guess people talk about this even to this day. There was no such thing as the term organic food, because everything was organic back then. It was kind of normal. Like you just, they have dates or apples or bananas and stuff. And that was like rice. That was like the staple diet, because they'll be cooking it directly from like the farm that they're kind of making all that food, right? Or growing the food. And I guess it's a shame that in this society, we don't look towards, what happened in history. And so we rely on the kind of the way that society is heading towards, which is basically eateries and quick feeds with the boys late at night, you know what I mean? A kebab shop,
Right.
Like obviously like we're taking those good memories, but at the same time, we have to be conscious to not kind of do it on a consistent basis to a point where we are dependent on processed foods, right? And as you mentioned yourself, it does contribute. And even Allah, mentions in the Quran to eat good, wholesome foods. So subhanAllah, I guess that's a different, it could be a whole episode for just food in general and the importance of it to have that nourishment in our body.
No.
And kind of segueing from that, because it was in relation to, happiness and depression and food possibly playing a role there. But because the whole kind of topic was before that, when we delved into the idea of food, was about depression in general. And so we have this kind of situation where, okay, people might suffer depression through external means, but even, as Muslims, there's people who, for example, pray 5 times a day, do all the rituals, you have a strong connection with Allah, and, fast and dhikr, everything. They're very obedient to Allah. And some people, and they're still depressed. And I've even read an article on this a few times, and I've, friends that are going through this. And so it's a shame that I guess it's not talked about. It's kind of taken for granted, especially in the society that we live in. Because even I've, friends and family that seem to kind of think that, just read more Quran and that depression will go away and stuff. But these guys are already, if not more practicing, and they're still suffering certain things, and so it's like, how do we kind of approach it, and how can we kind of assist people like that who are doing all the rituals?
Sure. As I said maybe earlier in our discussion, if I recall correctly, that you have to have a harmony. So on the one hand, I don't think more religious practices or recitation of the Quran is enough for everybody. Sometimes it is. Like some people, that, alhamdulillah, that does the trick. Others, it stays, even though they're doing all these things, as you mentioned. And in those situations, they likely need to do some deeper work or healing around some trauma or past wounds, so to speak. Because as long as that is not addressed or treated, you're just basically repressing or ignoring and neglecting a part of you that still needs that nourishment or healing or attention. And you have to have, in my opinion, a harmony between these two things. In other cases, people, they do what we call spiritual bypassing. And what that means is I use spirituality or religious practices to bypass addressing the real human issue or confrontation, let's say. So for example, if a guy's wife is criticizing him for not being responsible, or falling short with something, he just says, hey, okay, I'm just going to go pray, I don't want to talk about this, let me take it up with Allah. And he goes and he prays, and he thinks he's being righteous and handling the situation the way he should. But then he's actually not engaging with the human being, his wife, that is expressing her hurt or her desire. And so sometimes we overcompensate through religious practice or religious nourishment or spiritual nourishment in place of doing deeper work when it comes to human science, psychology, emotional cleansing, etc. So, to broadly just kind of answer that, I think it's important case by case to recognize what exactly they need. And if you know somebody who, let's say, their depression or their sadness or low moods is persistent, then it's likely because of a deeper issue or wound that hasn't been addressed properly. Or there might be even a biochemical basis for this. As we discussed earlier, sometimes people need more vitamin B12, for example, or their dopamine and serotonin levels, the threshold of release is much less than the average person, right? So they might need actual medication. Now, if somebody takes medication, my philosophy on that is medication is something to help you cope for the time being, or to stabilize you for the time being. But if you're not doing the deeper healing parallel to that, then what ends up happening is you also have, like, for example, in the United States, you have a lot of people who are over-medicated. They never do the deeper work, and they end up taking, these types of medications for 10, 20, 30 years or the rest of their life, because they never actually did the deeper healing.
So would you say the importance is to basically be aware of your situation and kind of assess the deeper issues that you might be going through and addressing it full on? And that would be the key to basically seeking that kind of, or getting out of the kind of depression that they're suffering.
Well, the difficult thing is most people aren't aware that they might have depression or PTSD or whatever, right? So I don't think that's an easy thing for each individual to be aware of. But earlier you're asking, how do we help people that are in those situations? Like, we see them pray or read a lot of Quran, but they're very depressed. So those types of individuals that, let's say, you observe, you counsel them and advise them to see somebody who specializes in that thing. When it comes to individual responsibility, of course, we do have to ask ourselves, as it is an Islamic duty, to have that reflection and to think more deeply on our matters, our lives, and what aspects of ourselves needs to be improved or purified. And I think that if somebody has that type of reflection, albeit it's not easy for everyone to do that, then sometimes it does cause people to go, you know what, I am going to go online, or I'm going to ask around and see if there's somebody I can speak to about this particular issue. And so, of course, there's always an individual responsibility, but we also, as a community, have to help each other out, especially if we see something that we know is not part of a person's normal pattern of their behavior or personality. We need to also reflect and ask those deeper questions about, how can I help this individual or support them? Sometimes it just has to do with somebody wants to talk. Somebody wants to, humans carry a lot of stuff on a daily basis, and there's a lot of things we keep to ourselves. And sometimes just doing that so much creates this sense of feeling stuck or drained, if you will. And I'll tell you, Akhi, that a lot of people, when I speak to them, they say, just being able to talk about this, something I haven't said to anybody in 10 or 20 years, just being able to release that gives me so much relief. And I'm like, yeah, because what's beautiful about the word nafsun in Arabic, self, it's connected to other, you take that same root word in its different forms. It means self. It means something that's precious. It also means breath or breathing. And it also means to release or to relieve oneself. In other words, like venting, when you say, oh, bro, I just need to vent. I need to let it out, right? So talking about it and sharing that in a safe space with somebody you trust and someone who can support you, either personal or professional, that in and of itself offers a lot of relief for our fellow humans.
that even reminds me, a lot of people talk about neuroscientists, for example. They say, if you're really stressed, just go out for a walk or do an exercise, and that kind of stress that you're suffering, it kind of leaves you, and because of the physical activity might be doing. So I guess it does reflect the whole idea of being aware about your situation, knowing how to address those. It's not necessarily something that the Quran, for example, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can directly fix. It's like you have to take that initiative to do it, and then I guess because you're doing that, then Allah will allow you to kind of ease your suffering.
Right, and think about it from a scientific standpoint of what we know about energy. Right, energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only be transferred from one form to another. Now, is the human being full of energy? True or false?
True.
Absolutely. We're full of, magnetic energy, biochemical, there's heat, there's electricity, all of these things exist within us. So of course, going for a walk, for example, or breathing or praying or going to talk to somebody about it, painting, whatever your coping mechanisms are, those things help because what you're doing is you're transferring the energy from it being lodged and stuck inside you, and you're objectifying it or transferring it outside of you or through the body, like through a physical activity. This is why many of us feel a lot better when we move, when we exercise, when we walk, when we breathe, when we stretch, when we do salah, and so on and so forth. So this is why often these types of techniques are suggested to heal or to relieve yourself and release or emit, if you will, all of this lodged energy that if it doesn't come out, it's going to impact us, because you can't just destroy it by ignoring it. And it's what we call repression. I just keep it in. I don't think about it. Once in a while it triggers and comes back, but then I shove it back down, deep down inside my psyche and unconscious, and I just go about my merry day. That doesn't actually work. It doesn't have long-term sustainability. Eventually you will crash or explode or fall apart, so to speak.
We were talking about basically having that relief, and that kind of relates to the next question that I wanted to ask you. In terms of modern psychology, from my kind of understanding, the whole idea of morale or morality at times seem to go out the window. And I guess it's that absence of moral accountability. So, for example, if you're, for example, a non-Muslim kind of seeking happiness, they might do it through other means that we as Muslims, say is haram, for example, zina or drinking, and I feel like from a psychological kind of standpoint, as long as they're happy, it doesn't matter, because it's about, making yourself feel good and this, that. And I guess there's an absence of morality. And do you feel like it's basically the whole idea of, a happy sinner? And I guess the happy sinner is basically championed as a success story in in secular psychology framework. So do you feel like that's the route that's kind of being laid within modern psychology?
Well, again, I can't speak for all, schools of thought in modern psychology. But, I do notice that, look, the bottom line is this: if our societies, especially in the West, which are very individual, it's all about individualism. It's individual centric, right? And now we're seeing more and more that my subjective space or my, personal preference of what makes me feel good or happy, that equals happiness. And that's going to be different for everybody. Now, sure, there's, truth to that. But what happens now when there's no standard to check what we identify as making us happy, like you said? So for instance, you could have, and again, speaking from a Muslim context, what makes me happy is to be able to sleep with all the women I want and go to the club every Friday night, right? That could genuinely make a person happy. But from an Islamic perspective, your nafs or your selfhood is stained and diseased with attachments to certain desires which are actually oppressive and darkening on your soul. And humans can adapt to anything. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, tells us to be careful about what we do, and if we experience evil, it's from ourselves, and if it's good, it's from Allah, because anytime we do something good, it's actually aligned with what we call the divine reality or the divine pattern. Okay, so the Islam is not about whatever makes you happy, which is exactly what everyone's talking about these days. Oh, if it makes you happy, if you identify with this act or this thing or that, even though it goes against what we would consider objectivity in science. So, for instance, like this whole gender fluidity phenomena, like I can identify as a woman, and people will have to start accommodating and accepting that and whatever pronouns I want to use. And they will say, well, look, Kareem, if it makes you happy, it makes you happy. We support that, right? Even though if I identified as an 85-year-old, Asian woman, no, everyone would be like, that's kind of strange, and it's not really objective. But hey, if subjectively it makes you happy, then we support that. So there is this issue where there's no standard or from our perspective, a divine manual that helps us check what exactly is good about what makes me happy and what isn't. And we try to align our desires of happiness and fulfillment to the Sunnah and the Quran. That's when we would consider somebody healthy or happy from an Islamic psychological perspective, because you're now aligned with what Allah and His Messenger brought. And this is exactly what the Prophet ﷺ said in the Sunnah. He said, a sign of faith is when your fitra, or your personality, not your fitra, your personality is aligned to what I have brought. In other words, you naturally enjoy or are inclined to the way of the Prophet ﷺ, right? So you'd rather drink milk than wine. You would rather eat just to your fill rather than overeat. You find joy in helping others, not just always serving yourself, etc. This is a sign of health and happiness, according to my understanding, at least, of Islamic psychology.
Because at the same time, we kind of experience, being in the West. However, do you feel like in the kind of modern psychology field, or even the psychology we may study at university, do you feel like we're heading towards a direction where it doesn't necessarily have to be, the majority, but there might be, a few psychologists or even big organizations that kind of deal with the whole field of psychology? Do you feel like because they look at, when they study the brain, they look at from such a kind of materialistic point of view, that we're heading towards a direction where morality is very hard to define?
Well, I mean, what do you mean by morality exactly?
So morality of, the kind of Islamic conception that, yes, there's certain things that define being good and bad. It doesn't have to necessarily be through the Islamic lens, but there has to be a sense of, okay, this, we know, like, this isn't good and this isn't bad, but because it's really hard to define what's good and bad through just purely materialistic point of view, especially when you're studying the brain, for example, do you feel like those are the kind of conversations that are happening within the psychological kind of field, where they're not sure about, okay, because I'm studying the brain and I can't really seem to define what's exactly good and bad, and the frameworks that might define morality, basically?
Well, I'm speaking more from a kind of philosophical paradigm. So Western psychology and the associations that be, like the American Psychological Association or Psychiatric Association, I'm sure there's one in Australia and something similar. They're coming from a philosophical paradigm which defines what it means to be human, what is healthy, what is unhealthy, what is right, what is wrong, what is happy. Or there's no, it's all relative too, which you find. It's like, well, if this married couple wants to have an open relationship and they're in agreement to both of them sleeping with other people, yet they stay married, and that's what makes them happy and fulfilled, Western psychology has space and room for that. In an Islamic psychological setting, obviously not, because even though that might make you happy or fulfilled, it's still considered morally wrong, because Islamic law dictates that that's an unacceptable setup. You follow? So of course you're going to see these types of things happening in a school of thought of psychology that has a different paradigm, but you'll also, of course, find similarities with Islamic psychology too. Like you don't go out of your way to hurt people, right? And often you hear that, like, oh, as long as you don't hurt anybody and it makes you happy, go for it, kind of thing, right? But we also forget that one of the people where we can always hurt is ourselves. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us this, right? That sometimes what you think is good for you, it's actually not. And sometimes what you don't like to do or you dislike, it's actually really good for you. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us that sometimes what feels good isn't always good. And so this is not necessarily a principle that often you find in the morality, if you will, of psychology in the West, generally speaking.
Okay. Before you kind of compared the idea of the nafs with happiness, I want to kind of break down the whole concept of happiness. If me personally going through life, even if I wasn't kind of like a practicing Muslim, I would define happiness to be that temporary happiness that is like a spark, regardless if you do good or bad. Like, for example, I don't know, playing football and scoring a really hectic header. Or there is a other kind of concept of happiness, being in the mode of, lust, for example, getting that girl you've been hitting on or something along those lines. And there's also the sort of long-term contentment that people seek in regards to being happy with their life overall on an overall day-to-day basis. So, but as a Muslim, which means you and kind of every other practicing Muslim defined to be true happiness is also tasting the sweetness of Iman, through worshipping Allah, especially, in situations such as, prostrating in prayer, a kind of happiness that, can't really be achieved by doing haram, or even kind of non-Muslims seem to not experience. So do you feel like, would you yourself classify, so I've defined kind of the categories of happiness, would you yourself classify happiness into these categories from a kind of psychological point of view? And what would you define to be true happiness?
Sure. So first off, I think it's a improper position to start off with when we say, like a lot of people, this is a common theme. Like, I just want to be happy, or I want to be happy all the time. I don't think you're supposed to be happy all the time. Do you? Do you believe you're supposed to be happy all the time?
Well, I guess we would like to be, but it doesn't happen. That's not the reality.
Right. It's not the reality now, but is that a bad thing if you're not happy all the time? Right. And by happiness, I'm talking about a higher state of satisfaction or, well-being, right? Because it's considered like, oh, I'm really happy, I'm getting married, versus like, oh, I'm really, happy because my favorite show's on. It's like even though we use the word happy in both circumstances, one of course has a higher weight or bigger weight than the other one. So happiness, I think, generally just means what we're pleased with, what gives us pleasure, satisfaction, gives us joy, etc. And so, can somebody be happy all the time? Probably not. And I don't think that's the goal. But yes, we can have long streaks, or the vast majority of our days, inshallah, are, we're either content, or we feel good, or we're satisfied. We're not, complaining and negative and sad and down. I mean, we're going to have the whole spectrum of emotions as human beings, right? That's why we're going to experience sadness and anger and joy and contemplation and, skepticism. And there's going to be all kinds of feelings and moods that we have throughout our lives. And so to try to just have one all the time, I think, is already the wrong premise to start with. Now, ultimately, we want to be happy most of the time, or more so than not. But again, that has many layers or degrees. Like right now, I'm pretty satisfied and content on my Saturday. I wouldn't say I'm so happy right now. Like, I'm just, beaming with fruity flavor and citrusy, bursting flavor, right? But that doesn't mean I'm sad or depressed right now either, And so that's the first thing. Is it's not about being happy all the time. It's about making sure that the vast majority of your experiences are healthy and positive moods, if you will. And that includes happiness and the degrees of happiness. But you can say, I feel at peace, right? For example, does that mean you're not happy or you're depressed? No, not necessarily. It just means you're at peace, which is also a state that you would say is positive, or a state that is not harmful or causing damage to one's mind or heart or body, so to speak. So I think that as mu'mineen, as Muslims, as believers, inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, tells us or advises us to find, we will find joy and success when we are aligned with, His reality, Azza wa Jal. And that doesn't mean you're not going to have hardships along the way. That doesn't mean there's going to be some days where you're like, meh, not really feeling so hot about work or doing this podcast, right? But you still do it, and maybe you feel better by the end of the day. I mean, how many times have you woken up feeling meh, but then by the end of the day you're like feeling pumped and energized and feeling good, and vice versa. So even within the day, we have a spectrum of moods and moments, if you will. So I think that we have to kind of think about it more holistically and recognize all the colors of emotions and moods is part of the greater painting. And we shouldn't just want everything to be yellow, for example, or just shades of yellow, which we would say is happiness, for example.
Do you feel like even, being a kind of Muslim psychologist, and if people come to you, talking about kind of achieving that contentment, do you feel like one of the ways you kind of approach it is for them to kind of taste the sweetness of Iman and prayer and worship? And that could be one of those ways to kind of facilitate happiness?
Absolutely. I try to make, as part of all my work with people, is we always have to put first things first. We have to center ourselves in the divine relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our lives, our sense of fulfillment and purpose and tranquility and joy and attachment to the right things, that's going to suffer if we don't have that relationship with Allah firm. And many people, including myself, have, I think, experienced firsthand that when you are closer to God, or God is on your mind and heart, and Allah says in Surah Al-Baqarah, فَاذْكُرُونِي أَذْكُرُكُمْ وَاشْكُرُونِي وَلَا تَكْفُرُونَ. Remember me and I'll remember you, and be grateful to me, and don't be those who cover up or deny the blessings. And so this, of course, is a reminder for us in the Quran, as well as many others, that this sense of happiness and joy is when you feel that connectivity to the divine, and you are, as a human being, in your proper place, because you recognize who you are in relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this, of course, is a magical, joyful experience, in my opinion. And so certainly this is a very important component to the work I do with the people that I serve. And I always like to start, any process I have with people, and talk about that. I say, tell me more about your relationship with Allah. Tell me about your relationship to Islam. What are some of your pain points about Islam? Like there's certain things that, you don't understand, or you're confused, or you doubt. Sometimes there's trauma from like Islamic Sunday school. I think everybody has a story or two about that. If not, alhamdulillah, good for you. But I mean, some people literally like had a lot of negative associations with the religion and people who always talked about God and the Quran. And they associate all that with negativity and pain and sadness, or inadequacy, because they were abused, let's say, at their Islamic school, or they witnessed things that were very harmful and disgusting. And yet these are the same people with beards and hijabs and caps on and preaching the Quran. So everybody's experience is going to have, I think, several layers to it that has to be explored. But I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, like that even reminds me of not just in psychology or Muslim psychologists, even because we did an episode with a marriage counselor, and he mentioned that even before the couples kind of sat down to discuss, what's wrong, he first addresses, like, first thing, how's your relationship with Allah, and that just basically gives away like why they're having issues. Because, if you're not doing for the sake of Allah, there have to be aspects such as humility, understanding for the spouse, because once you realize you're doing it for Allah, then, Allah commands, to understand your spouse, and, their spouse has rights and responsibilities. That actually solves a lot of the issues that, they come to the marriage counselor to address. And so not only just for marriage counseling, but even for entrepreneurship, for example, it's really a big thing amongst Muslim entrepreneurs. I was watching somewhere where one of the guys, he's like a mentor for all the people. He's like, I make sure I tell all my people that I coach that you have to get up for tahajjud, you have to pray fajr at the mosque, because you have to realize first, correct your intentions, and once you do it for the sake of Allah, inshallah, like we just gain the rewards, even though we may not reach our goal that we've kind of set. So I guess the whole kind of foundation is to realize why you're doing it and your intention, and we should do our best to always kind of purify intentions and see if we're truly doing for the sake of Allah, and having that strong relationship with Allah, regardless of what kind of profession or kind of field of study that we're in.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more.
SubhanAllah, even before you mentioned about basically how the starting point should be realizing the spectrum of emotions, and not just saying that, okay, we should solely focus or fixate on happiness because it's not ideal or realistic, and you can't really experience happiness every second of your day. And that kind of reminds me of, Hamza used to talk. He was like really emotional in it. It was just like, the dunya will only break your heart. And if you really want peace in the world, then you're in the wrong place, buddy, or something like that. And I feel like, subhanAllah, and I think he said a small story that I think he was in Saudi Arabia or something, and he was with a driver, and the driver was kind of letting out his emotions and being like, I'm struggling because I'm trying to send money back to my country that I'm from, and got to help my family out, and it's a struggle, this, that, and I've lost hope. And then Hamza Yusuf's like, just looks at him, it's like, the deen's all about hope, Islam's all about hope, subhanAllah. I guess that's kind of the way we have to view the world that we're in, because at the end of the day, it's all it's just temporal in nature, right?
Correct. Everything is transitory. Nothing is permanent. And, as soon as you lose hope in Allah or think negatively about everything, that's when we've really lost and become unhappy for real, right? But I mean, I can say, even from a personal experience, there were so many times in my life where, you're just in such a different place, difficult place. You didn't know how it was ever going to get better, how you were going to be able to get through this. And subhanAllah, you do get through it. And the more I think you go through these types of experiences, you learn and recognize that even though you're in a hardship or stuck in a rut, doesn't mean that's permanent either, right? Because impermanence is not just with, nothing stays happy or amazing all the time, every moment. And it's also true for the opposite. Nothing stays horrible and difficult all the time either, and the plug here is to remember that in your times of difficulty, it's not about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, picking on you, right? But rather it's a way to lift you up and make you recenter or reorient to what matters. And I've seen this happen over and over again. Like a family, one of their kids goes really astray or gets into some trouble, and all of a sudden it makes the whole family stop and recalibrate what are their priorities. And it's like, wow, this happened because all of us have been neglectful of our relationship to Allah or our relationship to our kids or whatever it is. And so this sometimes brings a lot of barakah and happiness as a result, because it's a way to redirect and recalibrate us to what truly matters. And if we just get caught up in just chasing the dunya, as they say, then you're gonna it's a sign that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still loves and cares for you when he makes the whole universe, put you in a situation where you have to stop and go, what am I doing with myself? Where am I going? What am I prioritizing? Why did this happen to me? What do I have to change? This is a gift when you think about it. And the more you go through that, the wiser you become, and the more equipped you become with lessons and knowledge that will also reduce, inshallah, the future mistakes or hardships like that to happen, especially from what we've caused from our own hands, right? And that's why people that, inshallah, as they get older and wiser, you don't see them getting into all this crazy trouble. Like, how many 45-year-old married men, for example, do you know who just keep getting, DUIs, driving while drunk, right? And they keep going to prison every couple of months because they just haven't gotten over this. I mean, sure, it happens, but it less likely happens with people that have gone through more of life than, let's say, younger people who still don't have all those lessons and experiences as part of their repository of personal wisdom.
Savannah, I think that's a kind of beautiful way to kind of, end the whole episode.
My pleasure, brother. Thank you for having me, and keep up the good work that you guys are doing over in Australia and everywhere. And I'll be sure to look out for this episode. And again, anybody who's listening, if you heard any mistakes or things of confusion, it's from myself. And if you benefited, it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm just a means for what Allah wants you to learn. So thanks again for your patience and giving me the opportunity.
No worries. Like, also, we're in tune with what you do out in, California and America. And especially, because I first heard you on the Mamam Looks and then kept up to date with your stuff. So I feel like, inshallah, like, may Allah bless, the works we're trying to do and hopefully correct our intentions, inshallah, because I think it is really important to have those conversations online. And it was something that I was pondering because I was at a wedding last night, and I was with my usual co-host. I was having a talk, and there was other people kind of talking about the podcast and stuff. And I guess people aren't kind of exposed to these conversations on a regular basis. And that was one of the reasons why me and Josh kind of started the podcast in the first place, because it's like, inshallah, people can benefit from it. Because I guess when you're with certain cliques and friend circles, you only tend to kind of talk about certain things, whereas these kind of conversations are interesting for, hopefully people can, benefit from in different ways in their life.
Absolutely. May Allah bless you and your companions of the cave. And may Allah give us tawfiq, inshallah. Ameen. Karim Sirajuddin here. Thank you for tuning in. Please visit nurhuman.com to learn more about how I provide personal, spiritual, and relationship counsel. Please generously help sponsor the show to keep on going at patreon.com/coffeewithkareem. That's patreon.com/coffeewithkareem.